This month at North, in our hallways and classrooms, we have been digging into the stories and the people who are central to who we are as Americans, Black inventors and barrier breakers, as well as the history we need to remember about where we come from and how we got here as a country and a community. Today we'll get to hear a conversation 3 students had with the Hopkins School's superintendent, Dr. Miri Piri Reed, and the Hopkins Director of Equity, Dr. Brown. Listen as these 3 students, 7th grader Kylie Fa, 8th grader Ramatullah Dem, and 9th grader George Jackson, along with the adults, think about why knowing about Black history and our own cultural history is important for all of us.
What do you guys remember about Black history when you guys were younger?
I identify as African American, but my father is African, and he didn't grow up in America, and my mother is white. And she did grow up in America, but she didn't grow up knowing anything about Black America. So when I was a child, my parents didn't talk to me about African American history, right? What we talked about was my father's African ancestry, and we talked about colonialism. So it's kind of an interesting thing for me because, you know how society puts you in a box? So they see like, oh, well, you have a brown face, you're probably mixed, you're probably Black and white, so therefore you're probably Black, so therefore you probably know a lot about Black history. Well, it's not that simple, right? And so I think because society was putting me in that box, then when I did get older and I realized that in order for people to make sense of me and in order for me to make sense of the world, I needed to learn more about Black culture because people were putting me in that box. So when I went to college, I took all the courses there were on African American literature, African American history, and I learned a lot about sort of Black America.
For me, I was immersed in the Black culture from birth. I'm from Harlem, New York. And Harlem was considered the surrounding of Black culture. And so I went to an elementary school that was all Black students, over 800 of us. But we were taught by teachers whom were white, but they had a very focused curriculum to teach us Black history. And so we knew early on about our history. They made no excuses. As a matter of fact, the day after Martin Luther King was killed, we went to school. And the front door was a life-size drawing of Dr. King with the caption, "Our King will live forever." And we were able to process with the nuns, what did this mean for the Negro, as we were called back then? What does this mean for the Negro? What is the future for the Negro in this country? And we were able to process with them, what was my specific role as a Negro growing up and moving into a white country. What did I have to do to be successful? And what did I have to do to make sure that I moved the history on?
Is there a story from Black history that changed the way you guys thought about your identity and who you are?
What stood out for me was how segregated the South was. And when I first went to the South, I remember my aunt telling me, she didn't tell me to cross on the green. She didn't tell me to watch out for the cars. What she told me was, if a white person walks down the street, on the sidewalk, you are to step into the street and bow your head. Afternoon, sir. Good morning, sir. And that struck me as being wrong. And I knew that it was inherently wrong because we were all born equal. And so, my mother sent me back down south. And so to live through that, I knew that one day that I would fight for equal rights, and I would fight that everyone is treated equally, and so that we will not have to live under such rule and under such pain. And so I've always been an advocate for equity, and I've always been an advocate for equal rights for everyone.
What was the hardest part growing up with segregation? Like, what was that like?
I think the hardest part was not being treated as a human, not being looked at as a fellow human being. I remember one time my aunt sent my cousin and I to the grocery store, and we had to wait hours before someone would acknowledge us, even, because when a white person came online, we were relegated to the back, and we would get up and we were relegated. And so I think the hardest part was not being seen as human and not being seen as equal.
How do you think knowing about our history, whether it be our family or our culture, helps us find a purpose in this world?
Where I am today and what I am today and everything that I enjoy today, education, home, clothes, car, someone was beaten, died, hung, and every kind of inhuman treatment done to them, so that in 2018, I have the luxury of sitting in a place like this school. Because 50 years ago, 60 years ago, a person of the color of my skin, we were not allowed in certain schools. We were not allowed in certain parks. We were not allowed in certain places, merely for the color of our skin. And so the movement of fighting for equal rights, I have to give them reverence because many of them died. Many of them were hung, beaten, had dogs set on them so that we could have equal rights, so that we could vote. And that's why any of my friends, Caucasian, Asian, Black, I always encourage them to know where your ancestors came from. If they came from Europe, know what part of Europe they came from, because they came over on a boat, immigrated to this country, so that you could have the rights that you have right now. And you have to give your ancestors reverence for that.
Who you are is informed by where you came from and who you came from and what your ancestors went through. So for me, being a leader, a woman leader, and being a leader of color, it's very important for me to know that there are very few women leaders at my level and above. So that's important that I send a message to girls, right, Kylie and Ramatula, and other girls, that as young ladies, you can be anything you want to be. You can be people's bosses. You can run the world, right? And as a person of color, it's very important to send the message that as people of color, we can do anything. But you don't realize the power of breaking through barriers unless you understand your history, unless you understand the cultural history within a country or a context. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm so thankful to be growing up in a time where things aren't as bad as they used to be and things are getting better, and we can walk on the same side of the street as people who are different skin colors as us. And while racism is getting better, it's not completely gone.
That's right.
Yeah. And What do you guys have to say to the future generation that will be the next leaders, the next presidents, the next everything? Like, what do you have to say to us?
You as young people have far more power than you realize, because adults listen to young people. Young people have a very fresh perspective, and you say things in ways that people will listen. And I think that your power, your collective power, is under-realized. You can do anything, especially as a collective. So I would just encourage you and your friends and other young people to identify an issue, a challenge, a problem, a dilemma that is deeply impacting society that you would want to change, that you would want to improve or eradicate, and start doing it.
What I challenge young people to do as the future generation is get to know people that do not look like you. Get to know people who do not worship like you. Get to know people who do not comb their hair like you, or don't live like you, or don't walk like you, or don't dress like you. Get to know those people and get to know them personally and get to know them so much that you become very good friends. I could have stayed in Harlem amongst all of my friends who I felt comfortable with. Fortunately, our teachers challenged us to move beyond Harlem. So I went to an all-white college and became friends with people who didn't look like me. And so that's how I got to be at a place where I'm very comfortable with people who do not look like me, comfortable with people whom I would never have known their culture if I hadn't branched out and said, "How are you?" If we can have young people like you who believe that we are moving into a society, that we are moving into a world of unity and equity, no matter what race you are, no matter what religion you are, no matter how you cook, how you eat, where you live, that we are all one on this planet, then we can fight racism head on. We will never eliminate it, but we can fight it head on. And that's how we get to break racism down. And that's how we will trip racism on its face. And I'm depending on you young people to do it, because it can be done. Because when I was young, we did not have a clue of what Dr. King was marching for would ever come to fruition. We didn't think it would, and especially after he died, we didn't think it would come to fruition. And I remember the older elders saying, "What are we going to do now? We don't have a person to speak for us. What will we do? Who will speak for us?" And that's when my teachers challenged us as young people. You are the future of the Negro race. You people, you young people, have to start thinking in your mind what you need to do to combat the racism in this country. And we've come a long ways, and we have a ways to go.
Dr. Reed and Dr. Brown remind us of the same message that we've been hearing all year, the idea of how important it is to both know and honor our own identity, and to get to know people who are different from us and hear their stories. One of the lessons we can take away from Black history are the stories of people who care deeply about something and work to make change. They can inspire us and remind us that all of us can make change. Today we ask you to gather in a circle to check in with each other. Is there a story from Black history, either America's history or your own family history, that inspires you? What is it? Why does it matter to you? Or, is there a problem or a cause you wish you could change? What would you do about it if you could?